Cheaters often face the consequences after a considerable period of time, and as a rule, they begin to realize how much they have ruined their lives. It's a pity that people don't think about the consequences before they commit any actions, especially those that endanger a full-fledged marriage. "Are you serious? You can't be serious," George Luquette stammered as Reynolds informed him he had just been served. "I'm afraid so, buddy," Reynolds replied, his face a mask of sympathy as he snapped a digital photograph of George holding the large brown envelope. George stood on the small porch of his home, staring at the hefty process server who wheezed and groaned as he stepped down from the porch. George looked back at his front door, keys still in his hand. "But I, George stuttered. "And sir, there's also a restraining order. You'll need someone from the police department to accompany you inside to collect your belongings," Reynolds advised as he waddled away. "Samantha, what's this about?" George yelled at the door. "Sir, you've been informed about the restraining order," Reynolds said, opening the door of his old Cadillac coupe. "Don't make this worse than it has to be, okay?" George shook his head in confusion. As far as he knew, he and Samantha had been happy. She had certainly left a lasting impression the night before he left for another 14-day shift offshore. He supposed 14 days was long enough for someone to decide they wanted to end their marriage and file for divorce, but he couldn't think of anything he had done or said that would make his wife take such drastic action. George considered calling his wife's cousin, Polly Chastain. But as he reviewed the divorce paperwork, he saw that Polly had been the one to prepare and file it. "Sir," a stern-faced police officer said, tapping on the window of George's truck. "Sir, you've been informed of the restraining order." "Wow, that was quick," George said, feigning surprise. "I just called it in, and you're already here." "No, I received a call that you were in violation of your restraining order," Brian Jochet replied. "Oh? So you're not here to help me get my stuff?" George asked. Brian called into the station to inform them he was there to assist George Luquette in retrieving his personal belongings from the house. George waited patiently as the police officer reported to his station. "You didn't really call it in, did you?" Brian smirked as he approached. "No, but as long as you're here," George replied. George was smart enough to keep quiet when Samantha let him and the police officer into the house. Samantha pointed to several garbage bags with a grin and mentioned that she had already packed all of George's things. George nodded and asked Brian, not Samantha, if he could make sure that everything he was entitled to was really packed. "Officer, I'm reaching into the nightstand for a gun," George said as they stood in the master bedroom. "You don't have," Samantha began, but stopped when George pulled out his own, Smith & Wesson, .44 caliber. "And my rosary beads. Mom gave them to me when I first took communion," George said, taking a silver rosary from Samantha's bedside table. "You gave them to me when we got married," Samantha protested. "And now I take it back," George explained. George also took 3 pillows from the bed, and then took out a large blanket from the closet in the hallway. "My sister sewed this for me," George quietly explained to Brian. "She was a complete idiot," Samantha scoffed. "And she called you sissy because she was so happy that she finally had an older sister," George reminded Samantha, wiping the smirk off her face. When George tried to check into the DeGard Inn, he discovered Samantha had been busy. His cards were canceled. A look at their joint checking account revealed a balance of only $100. George smiled at the nervous clerk and handed over his American Express credit card. The clerk's hand trembled as she took it, and George almost laughed when she exhaled with relief. "She didn't know about that card," George explained to the young woman. "I used it to buy her birthday and Christmas gifts." In the room, George read through the paperwork again. He almost spit out his Dr. Pepper when he saw Samantha's demands. $4,000 a month in spousal support. Full ownership of the house with George continuing to pay the mortgage and all utilities. In return, she would generously allow George to keep all the money in their savings and checking accounts. George was genuinely perplexed. There had been no indication of Samantha's dissatisfaction with him or their marriage. Sure, she called him a stick in the mud, but she'd been doing that for years. When they bought the house, Samantha wanted to immediately buy various items for it. Instead, George carefully planned each big purchase and doubled up on their mortgage payments each month. George explained to Samantha that it was all about equity when she suggested putting money into their vacation fund instead of their house account. But Hawaii, Samantha protested. It will still be there for our 10th anniversary, George reassured her. That's just 3 years away, and by then we'll have more money saved in both the vacation and house funds. Hawaii had been breathtaking. The pictures couldn't capture its true beauty. Samantha, with her fair skin and red hair, had looked stunning in her turquoise-blue monokini. George had enjoyed applying sunscreen to her luscious body. George hoped Samantha had packed his 3 Hawaiian shirts when she cleared out his side of the closet. He doubted he would ever return to the island paradise, but he loved the loose, comfortable shirts. With a sigh, George searched for a good attorney on his cell phone. Richards, Pellichet, and Jones, answered a pleasant voice. When he heard the voice announce the name of the law firm, the gravity of his situation dawned on him. George took a deep, shuddering breath. The pleasant-sounding voice repeated the name of the law firm once more. I need an appointment with a divorce attorney, George managed to choke out. Yes, sir, Ethel Gerard responded in a low, soothing tone. Ethel gathered some information and assured George that a lawyer would contact him within the hour. George thanked her and finished his Dr. Pepper. He mused again that a vending machine selling beer would be a huge moneymaker. Trevor Williams, came the voice when George answered his cell phone. I can see you tomorrow morning. How does 9:30 work for you? Trevor pulled some strings and got a judge to order the return of the funds to the bank accounts. Samantha was shocked when Polly called and threatened to withdraw from the divorce if Samantha pulled any more stunts. Samantha wondered how George had managed to get an attorney. She had purposefully withdrawn all the money, leaving just enough for George to rent a motel room for a few nights. She had canceled their credit cards before he left for his 14-day offshore shift and had the cards reissued in her name only. It doesn't matter how he managed to get a lawyer, he got one, Polly snapped. Cousin or not, I won't tolerate this nonsense. Do you understand? Grumbling, Samantha returned 50% of the funds to their checking and savings accounts. She also handed over 4 of the 8 CDs she had taken from the safety deposit box. What about the house, the mortgage? Samantha demanded. He will continue to pay half until the judge makes a decision on the division of assets, Polly said. And the electricity? Samantha demanded. He's not living there, you are. Pay your own bills, Polly sighed. You know, despite what your friends might have told you, you don't automatically get everything while he gets nothing in a no-fault divorce. And Samantha, these abuse allegations? You better be able to back them up. The courts really, really, really do not like being lied to or manipulated. Got it? With the money from his new bank account, George rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a relatively nice neighborhood in Kimball, Louisiana. The Casual was within walking distance, and Cowboy's BBQ was just a 3-minute drive away. The young couple who rented the apartment next to his were sociable, loud, and friendly. He worked at Kendrick's Engineering, and she was employed in the shipping department at Alana's Playtime. You work with Bowman? We're the ones who handle your upgrades and maintenance, Foster Chalmers said proudly. Yes, sir, George replied, smiling as he and Foster managed to wrestle George's nearly new sofa up the stairs and into his apartment. Denise Chalmers somehow convinced George to leave his mailbox key and a spare apartment key with her. She would check his mail and place it in his apartment. Their mailboxes were right next to each other at the apartment's kiosk. She was offended when George asked how much it would cost him. Foster suggested a six-pack of St. Elizabeth lager, but Denise slapped her husband on his buttocks. "We're neighbors, yeah. Neighbors do stuff like that," Denise said, her Cajun accent thick. "Can this neighbor buy y'all a six-pack of beer just because?" George asked, seeing the disappointment on Foster's face. The next time George saw Samantha, she had a noticeable baby bump. She was also standing with an arrogant-looking man in a very expensive suit. "And how far along are you?" George asked Samantha. "We can petition," Trevor reminded the stone-faced Samantha. "About 4 months," Samantha admitted. As the two attorneys argued back and forth, George glanced at his wife. She was truly beautiful, with waist-length red hair and porcelain skin sprinkled with a few freckles across her slim nose. Her deep brown eyes had captivated George from the moment he first saw her, and her pouty lips had kept him enchanted throughout their 12 years of courtship and marriage. Samantha Chastain had a petite frame, boasting a 29B chest, a 25-inch waist, and 30-inch hips with a cute bubble butt on her 5'5" frame. George had been infatuated with her from their first meeting, and the looks she frequently gave him indicated she felt the same way about George Allen Luquette. At 6 feet tall, George stood taller than the average Cajun male. His thick brown hair threatened to curl, and his deep tan complemented his square face, wide smile, and deep brown eyes perfectly. Working offshore as a roughneck had built muscle on George's frame. His clothes fit him snugly, and Samantha had been impressed with the sight before her. "And you can dance, too," Samantha had laughed happily as they twirled around to the lively music of the Zydeco band. Now, sitting in a courtroom at the St. Elizabeth Parish Courthouse, George looked again at his beautiful redhead. She had that happy glow that pregnant women often have, and George smiled sadly. She would likely get the larger breasts she had always wished for. Since Samantha couldn't provide any evidence of the alleged verbal and emotional abuse, the restraining order was lifted. Trevor smirked when George whispered that he didn't want to be within 500 yards of her anyway. "Maybe, but it keeps you out of jail," Trevor reminded George. "It means you can go grocery shopping without worrying that she'll show up in the next aisle and accuse you of violating the restraining order. The police wouldn't believe you didn't know she was there." "What? Why do you want that?" Samantha shrieked when George, through Trevor, demanded a paternity test. "It's not yours. It's about insurance. You don't have better insurance through your job, do you?" George asked. "But I'm already on your insurance," Samantha argued. "Oh, no, you're not," George laughed bitterly. "I dropped you the minute you had me served. Remember, you used to like my bubble butt just fine," Samantha sneered. "No, I loved your bubble butt. I loved all of you," George muttered to his attorney. "I'll put her and my baby on my insurance," William sneered. "Well, you can most likely kiss any spousal support goodbye," Polly hissed to Samantha. "What? Why?" Samantha demanded. "You and your boyfriend just admitted to having an affair while you were still married to and living with Mr. Luquette," Polly sighed. "In the future, keep your mouth shut and leave your boyfriend at home, okay?" Before heading off for another 2-week shift, George provided a blood sample to Dr. Frank Roberts. The doctor reassured George that conducting a DNA test while the baby was in utero was completely safe and would not harm the baby. However, the sample was actually taken from the amniotic fluid, not directly from the baby. Dr. Roberts informed both Trevor and Polly about George's concerns. When Polly conveyed this to Samantha, tears welled up in her eyes. "You know, maybe there's still time to reconsider," Polly quietly suggested to her cousin. Samantha simply shook her head. She left Polly's office and drove to Mouton Park. There, she sat on a swing, gently rocking back and forth until the sun's intense heat forced her back into her air-conditioned car. Bowman Engineering was insured through Young Insurance, while Tricarter, where William worked, had insurance through Mutual Fidelity Insurance Group. Dr. Roger Pallure accepted medical plans from Young Insurance but not from Mutual Fidelity. On the other hand, Dr. Ellen Sweetman accepted Mutual Fidelity, but Samantha had been seeing Dr. Peller since marrying George and joining his insurance plan. Samantha's only visit to Dr. Sweetman left her unimpressed with what she perceived as a rushed and impersonal approach from the doctor and her staff. Next time they gathered to discuss insurance and matters concerning George and Samantha's baby, William crudely boasted, "She gave me that great present." "Oh my goodness, please stop," Polly exclaimed sharply. "Seriously, William?" Samantha cried out, clearly embarrassed. George detected the smell of alcohol, certain it wasn't from himself, his lawyer, Samantha, or her lawyer. "Well, she always said I was too big," George responded calmly. "But congratulations, I'm sure it's fantastic." "Enough," Trevor whispered, trying to stifle his laughter. George smirked at William's embarrassed face as the paralegals and the reporter couldn't help but chuckle. William glared furiously at Polly as she ordered him out of the conference room. After completing the paperwork, Trevor and George both made a quick stop at the restroom. George suspected he had picked up a stomach bug during his shift offshore, as his stomach was unsettled. Trevor wished him well through the stall door before departing. "Yeah, gotta flush this out in 3 days," George grunted. Exiting the restroom, George nearly bumped into Samantha leaving the ladies' room. He apologized and let her pass ahead towards the glass doors of the office building. "Damn, she's got a nice figure," George mumbled to himself as Samantha walked ahead. Getting into his pickup truck, George noticed Samantha looking around. His initial impulse was to ignore her and drive off. After all, she had filed for divorce and kicked him out of his own home. But his better judgment prevailed, and he rolled down the window. "Problem?" he asked. William and I were parked here," Samantha said, pointing to an empty spot. "Where are you headed?" George asked, reaching for his cell phone. Home, I guess," Samantha replied. Okay. Oh, look, Uber's already on its way," George said, checking his phone. "You don't have to do that," Samantha said, embarrassed. "Samantha, even if you were a stranger, I couldn't just leave you here." "But you're not a stranger. You're the mother of my child," George said gently. "Hey, perfect timing. Dropping off a lunch order and I get a ride request," a smiling young man in a BMW said, pulling up. "Are you George?" "That's me. Thanks for coming," George said. "You're all set, Samantha. Have a great day." The scene closed with George ensuring Samantha got into the Uber safely before he drove away. Samantha's eyes welled up once more as she watched George's truck depart from the parking lot. Climbing into the back seat of the Uber, she waited while Polly's paralegal collected several bags from Cowboy's BBQ. "Man, I'm starving now, smelling all that food," the young man chuckled. "And I'm taking you to, oh hey, they have some really nice houses in that area." Yeah, they do," Samantha murmured softly. Denise had sent Foster over to George's apartment with a generous bowl of her chicken noodle soup. Both George and Foster exchanged amused glances at Denise's insistence that the soup would cure whatever ailed George. But he happily consumed every last bit. After rinsing the bowl, George filled it to the brim with Reese's Pieces. Denise had let slip that these were her favorite. Foster and George chuckled at Denise's delighted squeal. Despite her protests about calories and how fattening they were, Denise eagerly munched her way through a handful of the candies. While offshore, George utilized automatic bill payments through his bank. He couldn't explain it, but he smiled upon seeing a bill from Dr. Roger Palleur in the stack. "Hey, we're going to Vermilion. You coming?" Denise asserted as George walked in. "Sure," George smiled, knowing it was futile to argue with his determined neighbor. "Shirley Fournette is performing. You like her?" Denise continued. "She's got a friend from work she wants you to meet," Foster cautioned George when Denise went back to her bedroom to finish getting ready. "She's not from work. I just saw her at work," Denise corrected. Tammy Hale, a real estate agent with fiery red hair and a vibrant personality, immediately caught George's interest. They hit it off right away, dancing nearly every dance. When they paused for a beer, they chatted and laughed together. After a lackluster evening, Tammy and George parted ways with a friendly kiss on the cheek, acknowledging the absence of any real connection between them. Later, at their apartment, Foster teased George about his dating prospects. "I'm always working," George explained. "It's hard for me to meet women on my own." Denise chimed in triumphantly. "See? That's why you need to listen to me." "But Denise, no more redheads, okay?" George replied, showing a photo of Samantha on his phone. "Oh, why didn't you say something sooner?" Denise exclaimed, noticing Samantha's resemblance to Tammy. "Because you never asked," Foster interjected with a grin. As they closed the apartment door, Foster lamented, "Come on, woman! I took you dancing." Later, when George returned from a tense shift, he found a thick envelope on his kitchen table among other mail. He had been monitoring a tropical depression that threatened to escalate into a hurricane during his supervisory duties on the rig. Exhausted and relieved to pass the responsibility to his colleague Greg Bookhammer, George was grateful to step onto the boat and leave the worry behind. George chuckled as he checked his phone's Weather Channel app, noting that the tropical depression had lingered and finally dissipated that morning. However, the official notice of his divorce did little to lift his spirits. George sat quietly, poring over the legal language, briefly contemplating how Samantha must have felt when she received her own copy of the decree. He poured himself a few fingers of chocolate-flavored Iron Barrel whiskey, raising a solemn toast to his failed marriage. Meanwhile, offshore, William grumbled and fretted, driving Samantha to St. Elizabeth's Trauma Center. After 11 hours, the last two spent with only Dr. Pallur and a nurse in the delivery room, William had wandered off to the cafeteria. It was then that Samantha, exhausted but triumphant, gave birth to Cynthia Barbara Luquette. William was furious that the child had the surname of this jerk and not his own. "We're not married. Why would I name her Carter?" Samantha said wearily. "But isn't she beautiful?" "Uh-huh," William replied, barely glancing at the wrinkled and bruised bundle in Samantha's arms. Cynthia had all her fingers, all her toes, deep brown eyes and flaming red hair. At 6 pounds 4 ounces and 19 inches long, she was a healthy size for a newborn. George nodded with satisfaction upon receiving news of his daughter's birth. Barbara, his mother's name, came to mind. Did old William know this detail? Cynthia, Samantha's mother's name, also belonged to George's cherished sister. Did Samantha recall these connections when naming her baby Cynthia? Did she remember Cindy's joy at gaining an older sister? Did Samantha think of their trips to the petting zoo and the Bolorama, or holding Cindy's hand as she succumbed to her heart condition? Back on solid ground, George promptly purchased Raggedy Andy and Raggedy Ann dolls for his daughter. Samantha had a new phone number. The old one was no longer in service. George hesitated to visit unannounced and instead called Polly Chastain's office, who promised to reach out to Samantha. Samantha phoned George less than 3 minutes later, agreeing it was a good time for him to visit and see the baby. Upon spotting William's Mercedes-Benz in the open garage, George felt a pang of irritation. The implication was clear. William had deliberately left the door up so George would notice, signaling that he had been replaced by a wealthier, more attractive man. William smirked from behind Samantha when she opened the front door for George. Samantha beamed with joy as George presented 2 dolls to the peacefully sleeping girl. Placing them at the foot of the crib, he knelt down, marveling at his beautiful daughter, disregarding William's attempts to assert himself. "Oh, I almost forgot," George said, handing Samantha a small package. "This is for you." "What is it?" William demanded to know. "You'll see when she opens it," George replied calmly, refocusing his attention on the infant. "Oh, George, this is..." Samantha choked up as she saw the sterling silver 5x7 picture frame engraved with Cynthia's name and birth date at the bottom. "You can put her baby picture in there," George said, snapping a photo of Cynthia with his phone. "Hi, sweetheart. It's me. Hi, it's Daddy." Excuse me? She'll be calling me Daddy, William interjected. Maybe, George responded evenly, though he seethed inside. I'm sure she'll have names for both of us. William once again inserted himself into the conversation as George politely asked for Samantha's new phone number. Samantha had only seen private on her screen when she called him. Even when George explained he only needed the number for their daughter, William stubbornly insisted that George had no business needing Samantha's contact details. Okay, George sighed. I can always call Polly, I guess. 3 blocks away, George felt his phone buzz. He checked it and smiled. Samantha had texted him her number under the name Cynthia. The day before he had to go offshore again, Cynthia was awake and thankfully William was nowhere to be found. George was overjoyed to sit in the new rocking chair and hold his precious daughter in his arms, tears of happiness streaming down his face. Reluctant to let go even when the baby needed a diaper change and nursing, George cherished every moment. I'm sorry, but you need to leave, Samantha said softly, but firmly, as she began to unbutton her blouse. George was infuriated at the thought of William being allowed to witness his ex-wife breastfeeding their daughter once more. Resigned, he nodded and left the house. However, he chuckled upon seeing William's Mercedes-Benz turn the corner. George anticipated William's disbelief that he hadn't been permitted to witness the intimate moment. He grinned widely and waved at William as they passed each other, though the tinted windows obscured his view and he suspected William didn't return the gesture. Trevor had to intervene when Samantha hesitated about letting George have their daughter at his apartment. Samantha panicked at the thought of Cynthia not being in her own crib at home. Insisting on checking out the apartment, she wanted to ensure it was safe for their baby. "Hi there, I'm Aunt Denise. Hi," Denise Chalmers exclaimed excitedly as George carried the baby from his truck to his front door. "George, who is she?" Samantha asked anxiously, seeing the short, stout woman fussing over her daughter. "Hey, William, can you believe the Saints drafted Jameis Winston?" "Breeze retired, but what about Taysom Hill, huh?" Foster asked eagerly, while William kept a close eye on Samantha, glaring at everyone and everything. "What? It's William, okay? Not Willie," William corrected firmly. Reluctantly, Samantha agreed to the cast-iron crib, matching the queen-sized bed also crafted from cast iron. As expected, the bed was impeccably made. She noticed George had a small wash bin that he neatly placed in the sparkling clean bathtub when it was time to bathe his daughter. Samantha wasn't surprised to find baby soap, shampoo, and lotion in the bathroom. "And I told him to get that A&D ointment because it's the best for diaper rash." Denise showed Samantha the tube in George's medicine cabinet. "So are you using cloth diapers or disposable ones?" "Disposable," Samantha replied, still uncertain about this Aunt Denise. Denise murmured in response. Samantha discovered that William and Foster had bonded not over their love for the New Orleans Saints, but over George's chocolate-flavored Iron Barrel whiskey. Samantha stoically held out her hand for William's car keys. "What? Jesus! I only had 2, maybe 3, William protested. "Foster," Denise said sharply, clearly displeased with her husband for helping himself to their neighbor's alcohol. "Man, we gotta get, what is this? Iron Barrel, oh. Hey, chocolate? Denise, did you know they make whiskey in flavors?" Foster exclaimed happily and drunkenly as Denise ushered him out of the apartment. "Keys, or I'll call an Uber," Samantha demanded as William staggered off George's comfortable couch. After planting a goodbye kiss on Cynthia's cheek, Samantha led William towards the car. George watched Samantha's curvy silhouette retreat, then closed the door with a sigh. Samantha deliberately chose a Sunday when George would be present for Cynthia Barbara Luquette's christening. During the ceremony, Samantha's father, Richard Chastain, took the opportunity to express his disappointment with his daughter's choices. Richard and George had always had a strained relationship. Richard believed Samantha could have aimed higher than marrying someone from the oil field, even after George's promotion to shift supervisor. Now, with William Carter, one-third owner of Tri-Carter, Richard wasn't convinced his daughter had upgraded. Watching George flinch as Cynthia cried during the baptism while William appeared disinterested only confirmed Richard's doubts. "It wasn't my idea," George defended as they nibbled on snacks at Samantha's home after the ceremony. "Yeah, I know. At least she was upfront about that," Richard reluctantly agreed. "That woman calling herself Aunt Denise, is she your girlfriend?" "No, she's married to the guy in the Saints shirt over there." George chuckled, pointing to Foster, who was juggling hot meatballs and whistling to cool them down. The party wound down quickly. Foster and Denise left early. Foster didn't want to miss the second half of the Saints versus Panthers game. Some of Samantha's co-workers from Casa Ole Mexican restaurant departed as soon as they realized there would be no more alcohol. "She'll be calling me Daddy," William teased George, who was rocking the baby. "Oh, I'm sure she'll have a name for you," George replied, meeting William's gaze. "William," Samantha interjected firmly. "And if she doesn't? I have a few suggestions," George smirked, earning a chuckle from Richard. "George," Samantha said tersely. "Bye, sweetheart, bye," George softly crooned to the sleeping infant. "Daddy misses you already." "Thank you," Samantha murmured quietly as George placed his hand on the doorknob of their daughter's room. "The cross and chain are beautiful. I'm sure she'll wear them with pride once she's old enough." "I'm sure she will," George smiled. On Monday afternoon, George was returning from the laundry room of their apartment building when he noticed a young girl standing in front of Denise's door. Her thick brown hair was pulled back tightly in a high ponytail, almost touching the sidewalk. When she turned to see who was behind her, George was struck by her clear green eyes. "They usually get home around 5:30, 6 o'clock, George offered. "Oh, okay," the girl nodded, turning fully to face him. George noticed that she wasn't a girl, but a petite woman. Her delicate features adorned a small round face perched on a slender neck. Despite her slim torso, her 27C bust seemed notably prominent. George estimated he could easily encircle her waist with his hands, and her hips looked great in her short gray skirt. Judging by her height, around 4 feet 10 or 11 inches, and her shoes with 3 or 4 inch heels, George figured she was quite petite. "Hi, I'm George," he greeted as he unlocked his apartment door. "George Luquette." "Oh, you're George? The one with the adorable baby?" the young woman exclaimed, her pretty face breaking into a wide smile. "Yes, ma'am, that's me. And let me tell you, none prettier than my Cynthia," George proudly affirmed, setting his laundry basket down. George pulled out his phone and showed the young woman the latest photos from Cynthia's christening. "Aw," she sighed. "Hey, so you've met Cha-Cha," Foster interjected. Charlene Chalmers' expression quickly shifted from adoration to a displeased scowl. She glanced from Foster's amused face to George's mildly curious expression. "And I see you've met my second favorite brother," Charlene retorted. "And how many brothers do you have?" George asked, fairly certain Foster only had sisters in his immediate family. "One," Charlene snapped. George took his laundry inside his apartment and then entered the Chalmers place. Foster was brewing a pot of coffee, a habit that bewildered George considering how much caffeine Foster and Denise consumed, yet still managed to sleep. "Foster mentioned you work offshore?" Charlene asked. "Yeah. Heading out tomorrow to fix something," George replied, explaining his laundry. "I'm an administrative assistant," Charlene said proudly. "She works just up the street," Foster added, his own pride evident. "Where do you work?" George inquired, noting how young Charlene looked for such a position. "I'm with Vickers and Dumas. They specialize in investigations," Charlene answered. "Maybe they should investigate where the rest of you went," Foster teased. "Hey, George, you noticed. She's barely 3 feet tall." "George, got any coffee next door?" I won't stay here until Denise gets back, Charlene said, already getting up from her chair. I'll whip some up quick, George offered. Hey, Foster, maybe they could investigate why you're such a pain, huh? Yeah, Charlene chimed in, leading George out of the apartment. Coffee's almost done, Foster protested. When Denise gets here, tell her your sister's next door, George called back. Back in his own apartment, George learned that Foster's sister's full name was Charlene Paula Chalmers. Due to her name, she was stuck with the dreaded nickname, Cha-Cha. Charlene, 19 years old, had completed her administrative assistant training at St. Anne Votech, supported by the Nicole King Scholarship, which covered her tuition. She planned to allocate 5% of her earnings to repay the scholarship as gratitude. My cousin Michelle, she did 4 years at ULD, got herself a degree in, literature? Now she's an AA over at St. Elizabeth Water, Charlene shared casually over coffee. By the way, I like your mug. Where's Isle of View? Is it in the Gulf? Slow down a bit, George advised, pouring his decaf. Isle of View, Charlene articulated. Well, even though we've just met, I love you too, George teased with a smile. Isle? Oh, Charlene exclaimed, breaking into a joyous laugh. My boneheaded husband says you're here, Denise announced as she entered. George, did you show her pictures of that adorable baby? Sure did, Charlene replied, eagerly embracing her petite sister-in-law. Did Foster tell you I'm working right up there? At Vickers and Dumas? Lopez Square? Right there? Denise confirmed, pointing towards the unassuming building. Yep, Charlene confirmed proudly. George found himself being pulled back to the Chalmers' apartment while Denise prepared their supper. During dinner, George decided to get Charlene her own 16-ounce mug with Isle of View printed on it. Discovering that her favorite color was pink was straightforward. Foster, Charlene, and Denise all answered that question simultaneously. Somewhere between the meal and George finally leaving the apartment, he found himself promising Charlene a night of dancing in Vermilion the next time he was home from his shift. Aunt Denise promptly volunteered to babysit Cynthia Luquette. Hey, listen, my sister. My baby sister, she's only 19, Foster growled at George. And? How old were we? Denise shouted at her husband. Oh my God. Could you be more of a butthead? Charlene yelled at her brother, blushing. When he returned from his 14-day shift, George insisted on picking Charlene up at her parents' house. He insisted on meeting Hank and Debbie Chalmers. Charlene watched in amazement as George and her overprotective father swapped stories about past deer seasons. The two men vowed to try hunting together in the upcoming season. Of course, this one here... Ew. Daddy, I don't want to eat no deer, Hank teased his daughter, affectionately giving her a pat on her backside. Hank, Debbie smiled, shaking her head. Daddy, Charlene protested. Overall, the Zydeco band was talented, albeit spoiled by an annoying vocalist. The blind guitarist, despite his skill, sang through his nose, which did not quite match the music or his voice. However, the band performed live music, perfect for dancing. George's pickup truck, parked in front of her parents' house, was steamed up from their kisses. Charlene wanted more, but because of the presence of her parents, she had to be restrained. When George escorted Charlene to the front door, she asked, When will I see you again, George? Hank abruptly opened the door and asked, What have you all been doing parked in this truck for the last 10 minutes? Charlene squealed when she caught George grinning at Hank's playful look. We were just wondering when you'd come out and have a heart-to-heart with me, George replied casually. Good night, Charlene. Good night, Mr. Hank. I'm Mr. Hank to you, young man, Hank chuckled, ushering Charlene inside. Yes, sir, Mr. Hank, George said with a smile. Tomorrow night I plan to invite her to dinner at Sweet Pea. Is that okay with you? What's on the menu? Hank asked, amused by Charlene's complaints echoing inside. Does it really matter? You know it's going to be great, George grinned as he hopped into his truck. The stuffed pork chops received high praise. Charlene surprised George by finishing her entire plate, Despite their full stomachs, neither had space for dessert. Samantha had grown accustomed to Denise's domineering personality by now, even considering her a friend to some extent. So, when Denise eagerly asked to see new baby pictures, Samantha responded with genuine smiles. It wasn't a shock to George when Samantha and Cynthia arrived at his door with the baby. William opted to stay in his car. Besides drinking, he had little in common with Foster. Samantha had made it clear that William wasn't allowed to drink at George's place. He politely nodded at George's eccentric neighbor, who waved at him cheerfully. Okay. Well, you've got this." "Yeah, I know you do," Samantha babbled as she kissed Cynthia. "If you need anything, just call, okay? Bye, sweetheart. Bye, Cynthia. Mommy already misses you. Bye." Within 5 minutes of leaving the parking lot, Charlene was knocking on George's door. "Hey, is she here? Is the baby here?" Charlene demanded, entering the apartment. George put on a pot of decaf coffee as Charlene excitedly cooed over the infant. He placed his green Isle of View mug and her new pink Isle of View coffee mug on the table. "Can I hold her?" Charlene asked, already cradling Cynthia as she took her into the living room. "Would it make any difference if I said no?" George smiled. "Nope," Charlene replied, settling onto the cozy couch. "Hi, Cindy. Hi, sweetheart. Hi." George's eyes welled with tears as Charlene softly sang Cajun songs to the baby. Those were the same songs his mother used to sing to him and his sister Cindy. Even at 15, Cindy would demand their mother sing those songs. Cindy would have adored you, George thought, watching the beautiful 19-year-old girl hold the baby in her arms. "Oh, what a lovely view," Charlene remarked, reading the inscription on her coffee mug. "Love you too. I'm about to heat up some stew. Are you staying?" George inquired. "Huh? No, my mom's making her stovetop stuffed peppers. She got the recipe from that cast-iron skillet show." "Do you watch it?" Charlene asked. "Milt Duhan?" "Yeah, I do. Loved the episode with Gator and Rat from that kids' show," George recalled. "Oh, I know. I laughed so hard when he pretended to hit Gator with his frying pan," Charlene giggled. After a steamy kiss, Charlene left George's apartment. George enjoyed his supper, then bathed his baby girl and fed her a bottle of breast milk. He tried to recall the lyrics to the lullabies, but ended up humming most of the tunes as he held the baby close. The management company had left a notice in the mailbox. George had 1 month left on his lease. They offered a $100 discount on the first month's rent if he signed up for another year, or $50 off for a 6-month lease. Opting for a month-to-month arrangement would mean a $25 increase each month. "Denise did one good thing," George mused as he dialed Tammy Hale. "So what are you looking for?" Tammy asked warmly. "Denise mentioned you have a baby. Congratulations." While George and Tammy chatted, he browsed the Davis Realty website and spotted a single-story home just 3 blocks from his old place. He shared the address and MLS number with Tammy. "Oh, that one?" "Yes, it's priced to sell," Tammy confirmed. "I can pick you up and—" "Tammy, unless you have a car seat, I'll meet you there," George interrupted. Denise insisted on joining, so Foster reluctantly tore himself away from ESPN Sports highlights. "Look at that fenced yard. Perfect for a swing set," Denise exclaimed. "The basketball hoop's already set up," Foster noted, eyeing the old backboard above the garage. "Just needs a new net." "You're taking that down, right?" Denise asked George. "I am?" George chuckled. "Of course, we don't need Cynthia becoming a basketball star," Denise teased, "and this room will be perfect for her crib." Charlene visited the following night and gave her approval. The house was a 15-minute walk from her parents' place, even quicker by bike or car. "And it has a gas stove?" Charlene asked eagerly. "Tammy, let's get started on the paperwork," George decided. The application was approved and George's home loan was rubber-stamped by First National Bank of DeGard. Foster oversaw the loading of George's furniture as short moves arrived at the apartment complex. Denise supervised the unloading of boxes and furniture at the new home. The three strong movers were professional, courteously agreeing with everything Denise said. "Thank you, ma'am," the foreman said gratefully as Denise handed each man a slightly crumpled $20 bill and an even more crumpled $5. "Man, whoever she's married to must really toe the line," remarked one of the movers as they hurried to their next job. "My mom? She could whip you with a wooden spoon and cook dinner with the same spoon 5 minutes later," the foreman agreed. "Those Cajun women, don't mess with them." Samantha arrived with Cynthia and William at George's new house. George greeted Samantha and William graciously, though he privately disliked the arrogant, smirking man in his home. George understood that being rude or unwelcoming would achieve nothing. "Wow, this place is so close you could almost walk here," Samantha remarked. "Yeah, we'll probably be out walking around a lot," George said, showing Samantha the new stroller he had bought. "Uh-huh. No pool?" William sneered, peering through the atrium doors into the backyard. "William," Samantha said tersely. "What? Can't say anything without you getting pissed off?" William retorted. "Hey, whose Benz is that?" Charlene asked, entering the house. "Mine," William said, smiling, his gaze momentarily lingering on Charlene's chest before meeting her eyes. Considering that Charlene was significantly shorter than William, he had to look down to see how the blouse stretched. William didn't notice Charlene's annoyance as she tried to cover herself with her hand. George? This is, Samantha interjected, feeling defensive as her boyfriend stared intently at the stranger's outfit. "Samantha, meet Charlene Chalmers," George introduced hesitantly. "She's, my girlfriend." It was hard for George to admit that this amazing girl was his girlfriend, partly because he still had a hard time coming to terms with the fact that Samantha was his ex-wife and not his current one. "Charlene, this is Samantha," George continued. "She's Cynthia's mom." "Nice to meet you," Charlene replied, moving closer to George and squeezing his hand, hinting that an explanation would be needed later about his awkward introduction. "Uh-huh," Samantha replied shortly, glancing at William, who continued to stare at Charlene. George installed a changing table and a new low chest of drawers in Cynthia's nursery. Samantha was not surprised to see that the changing table was in harmony with Cynthia's crib, as well as a charming lamp with the image of a ballerina gracefully holding a lampshade. That was one of the things that had greatly annoyed Samantha about her ex-husband. Everything had to be immaculate and perfectly arranged. Their finances were no exception, meticulous, orderly, and well-managed. They had the money. They could have gone to Hawaii. However, George insisted on waiting. "We had plenty more money for so many other things," Samantha muttered, noticing the toy box in the closet filled with new toys waiting for Cynthia to play with. "Let's go," Samantha suddenly insisted, taking William's hand. Samantha almost smiled. She could predict Charlene's reaction. George was about to get an earful over some perceived offense. William, absorbed in his own thoughts as usual, sensed Samantha's grip on his hand and knew another lecture about some alleged wrongdoing was coming. He glanced once more at Charlene's impressive figure and casually asked Samantha if she had ever considered breast implants. George did receive the earful. Tearfully, Charlene questioned whether he was ashamed of her, embarrassed by her. Or perhaps, was he still not over his ex-wife? Did he still harbor feelings for the beautiful redhead? George embraced and kissed Charlene, effortlessly lifting her in his arms. Gently, he explained the emotional struggle he'd faced with his ex-wife and his current love being in the same place at the same time. "I'm your love?" Charlene asked softly, melting in his embrace. As George and Charlene reconciled, snuggled on his sofa, William waited impatiently in Samantha's living room, sprawled on her plush couch, anticipating her usual scolding. He idly wondered if an engagement ring might finally quiet her. He had once considered whisking Samantha away, minus the crying baby. Goodness, how incessant were those cries, and would they ever cease soiling diapers, on an Alaskan cruise, proposing as they strolled a glacier, But now, with George occupied watching their child, his mind settled on proposing sooner rather than later. "I'm heading out," Samantha announced, rushing through the living room toward the garage. "I don't know when I'll be back. You're on your own for dinner, okay?" "Sure," William replied, rising to his feet. "Love you." William didn't notice Samantha's lack of reciprocation. He made his way to the corner bar, pouring himself a generous amount of George's St. Elizabeth Premium whiskey. He topped off his glass, with a bit more for good measure. "Need to see you," Samantha had texted her cousin Polly while William drove the short distance from George's new place to theirs. Polly's reply didn't please Samantha. She and her wife were at the Casual, a dive bar they frequented. Samantha would have preferred the privacy of Polly's office, or even better, Polly's cozy home, without Whitney there. Samantha didn't have any ill feelings toward the charming, blonde Whitney. It was genuinely difficult not to appreciate her bubbly, sweet, affectionate nature. However, Samantha felt awkward about their orientation. In Whitney's absence, Samantha could ignore Polly's lifestyle and pretend it didn't exist. "Hey, Terry, pour me another oak leaf, will you?" Polly cheerfully called out as Samantha entered the cozy, quiet bar. "Yay!" Whitney giggled happily, leaning against Polly. "Joe Bob, Carla's on her way," Terry, an older man, informed a severely drunk customer. "Aw, shit, great. She sees me like this," Joe Bob slurred, resting his head on the bar. "Take it slow," Whitney advised when Terry placed a shot glass of amber liquid in front of Samantha. "Oh, wow, this is good," Samantha exclaimed, savoring the smooth whiskey. "So, what's new?" Polly asked, guiding Samantha and Whitney to a corner booth. Samantha began to speak, hesitated, took another sip of whiskey and shook her head. When Whitney moved to assist Samantha, Polly gently placed her hand on Whitney's thigh. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a beautiful yet disheveled blonde woman. They couldn't hear her words to the drunk man, but they sensed the desperation in her voice. Yeah, damn it, let's go," Joe Bob grumbled, staggering off his stool. After pausing for a breath, Samantha turned her gaze to the dark-paneled wall and began to speak. Softly, she confided in the two women about feeling suffocated, trapped in her marriage to George Luquette. She expressed her yearning for life, for fun, yet George seemed incapable or unwilling to be spontaneous or adventurous. "He even insists on making the bed before he leaves the room," Samantha exclaimed. "He swears he can't step out until—" Whitney giggled and Polly playfully swatted Whitney's arm. Samantha, absorbed in her grievances about George's meticulousness and lack of spontaneity, didn't notice the affectionate interaction between her friends. She went on to recount her encounter with William during Margarita. Friday. Samantha, known for her attractiveness and what many admired as a shapely figure, often attracted attention from male and occasionally female customers. Most were dissuaded upon seeing her engagement and wedding rings. "George scrimped and saved every penny," Samantha murmured, glancing at her bare finger. "He even took up house painting during his spare weeks." "Aw," Whitney couldn't help but sigh admirably. "Yeah," Samantha agreed softly, attempting in vain to get another sip from her now empty glass of fine whiskey. On that Friday morning, Samantha casually mentioned to George that she had spotted a shiny new Lexus on the road recently. She hadn't expressed any desire to own one herself. She simply noted its appeal. George promptly dismissed any thought of her getting a new car of any make or model. "The moment those wheels hit the ground, depreciation kicks in," Samantha mocked George's voice later. Samantha went to work that day with a sour mood. While serving in her section, she encountered William Carter, a charming man adorned in an expensive suit, a large diamond ring, and a Rolex watch. After he left, along with a receipt generously topped with a 100% gratuity, William also left his business card. "Not the first time someone's left a business card," Samantha muttered to herself. Yet this time was different. She didn't toss the card away like before. The Tri-Carter logo adorned the top right, and in the center, William Carter, President of Sales, was boldly printed. On the back, William had personally written his cell phone number. At first, forbidden relationships were exciting, spontaneous, and enjoyable. Then George appeared in the frame. For a whole week, I had to play the role of a good, obedient wife, do everything right, squeeze out every penny until Lincoln cried, Samantha reflected. And now what? Polly asked after a long silence. And now what? Samantha thought about it, staring at the countertop. Indeed, they no longer needed to save money. If Samantha had wanted cinnamon rolls, she could have bought Pillsbury instead of the cheaper Burns & Burns Grocer's brand buns. She could have chosen round eyes for beef stroganoff instead of the stew George always insisted on. She and William went to the movies at regular times, not just for discounted matinees. William would go to the kiosk and buy a large popcorn with added butter. After that, they were treated to ice cream. Yum yum ice cream. George was always hesitant about such expenses. They could either grab a large portion of popcorn and have a drink, or go out for ice cream after dinner. Okay, so George is a frugal man, Polly remarked. No, it's not like that. He's not a cheapskate. Samantha stood up for George. He's just extremely practical. William was anything but practical. He never thought about saving money for a rainy day. All his life, he always had a golden umbrella. Samantha had been reflecting on the awkward Sunday dinner at Minnie Carter's house the previous weekend. The food itself had been excellent, prepared by Minnie's very proper English house servant. However, Minnie had been polite yet distant towards Samantha, barely acknowledging Cynthia's presence. Natalie, William's sister, had been more welcoming, despite her lively 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth causing a bit of chaos. Andrew, William's younger brother, had brought his wife Victoria, who stood out with her facial piercings and tattoos. Andrew preferred to call her Rhea, a fact Samantha had mistakenly mentioned aloud, earning a sharp correction from Victoria. Samantha, sweetie, we're not close like that, Victoria had said firmly. So please don't call me Arie, okay? Sorry, I didn't mean to. Samantha had stumbled over her words, flustered by the exchange. And with that, any chance of real conversation had ended. Samantha's compliment about his cooking was met with a stoic nod from the elderly servant. Samantha thanked Minnie for inviting her to dinner at her lovely home, but Minnie merely nodded, a forced smile plastered on her face. From the moment Samantha arrived at Miss Barbara's house, George's mother whisked her into the kitchen. Naturally, Cindy wanted to join, and the 3 women cooked Sunday dinner together while George and his father sat watching a tedious football game on TV. When you go, Cindy ordered when George peeked into the kitchen. It's just us girls, no boys. Yeah, Samantha giggled, earning a radiant smile from Cindy. Every Sunday was etched in Samantha's memory like that. The warmth of the Luquette kitchen, the aromas, the laughter. Cindy's constant need for approval from Miss Barbara and Samantha. Samantha was certain the next Sunday dinner at Miss Carter's house would be just as awkward, just as uncomfortable. And the one after that, too. William hadn't noticed. He was genuinely surprised when Samantha spoke of her unease. I think I've got a serious case of buyer's remorse, Samantha confessed to her cousin, tearing her gaze away from the dark wood of the table. And, Polly urged. And nothing. Absolutely nothing, Samantha sighed, finishing off the last sip of her drink. Back at her house, Samantha warmed up a lean dish. Despite not being in the mood, she reluctantly gave in to William's insistence and engaged in intimacy. William approached George and asked if he could look after Cynthia for 2 weeks while they went on a cruise. George took action, not for William and Samantha, but for his daughter. Samantha felt uneasy when they boarded the ship. When Cynthia was at George's, she was only a few minutes away, but now they were hundreds of miles apart. If Cynthia needed her, Samantha had no way of contacting her. Dude, do you hear that? William exclaimed excitedly, lying on a cot in their cabin. Samantha replied, looking around. What a silence. No screaming and crying children, William chuckled. In that moment, Samantha's heart overflowed with hatred towards William Carter. Her baby, her precious little girl, was not a spoiled child. Her daughter was not an inconvenience, not a burden. Meanwhile, trekking across the glacier, William knelt down, presenting a ring adorned with a 4-carat square-cut diamond. To Samantha, it seemed one of the most unattractive rings she had ever laid eyes on. It appeared ostentatious. Despite its likely hefty price tag, Samantha found the ring garish and tacky. No, Samantha quietly and firmly responded. What, are you serious? You've got to be kidding me, William spluttered, genuinely taken aback. There's no point in making things worse, William, Samantha sighed, turning to rejoin the tour group. The journey back was marked by icy silence. For Samantha, it was a more pleasant return. William wasn't pressuring her for intimacy, and she was closer to being reunited with her daughter. When Samantha opened the door, she found William hurriedly packing his things. Grabbing her car keys, she rushed off to retrieve her baby and bring her home. Hey, she's almost asleep, George, looking worn out, whispered as he let Samantha into the house. Samantha stood quietly, listening to Charlene sing softly to Cynthia. It reminded her of Miss Barbara singing those same lullabies to Cindy. Tears welled up in Samantha's eyes as she recognized the familiar tune. Yeah, Mommy. Looks like we've had a rough week with colic, George admitted, as Charlene carried the sleeping child out of the room. Colic? Oh no, Samantha exclaimed, feeling terribly guilty that her baby had been suffering while she wasn't there to help. Hey, Samantha, Charlene greeted tiredly as she entered the kitchen. So? How was it? I've never been to Alaska, you know. I hated it, Samantha admitted. I'm drinking your last beer, Charlene informed George. Are you? Even though I just put another 6-pack in there? George asked. I see you're still doing 1 6-pack at a time, Samantha teased softly. Uh-huh. Well, the pantry's got a lot more room, George defended. Samantha, do you want anything? Charlene offered, opening a barley Turlings. How cold is that beer? Samantha asked. It should be cold by now, George replied. Okay, I'll come by tomorrow. When are you going offshore? Samantha inquired before checking on Cynthia. Tuesday, George replied. Then it won't be 4 weeks until I'm back. I swapped with Greg for an extra week. It's just like you to do that, Samantha thought, feeling a mix of admiration and frustration at George's practicality. No, can't use any vacation days. No, have to strategize every detail for the best outcome, damn it. True to William's style, the house looked like a tornado had swept through when Samantha returned. Nothing was broken, but nothing was in its place either. Dresser drawers were left half open, clothes hangers strewn on the floor and bed. Samantha sighed as she tidied everything away, then ran the vacuum throughout the entire house. She couldn't help but smirk. She was following George's exact routine. Cynthia's child support payment always arrived 3 days early. Due to Samantha's infidelity, she hadn't been granted any alimony. Back then, though, Samantha hadn't needed it. She had William and his credit card to rely on. 2 months after William left, Samantha realized she was in trouble. Her savings were depleted. Faced with a choice between paying the mortgage or utilities and buying food, she couldn't afford both. Most of her child support went to Happyland Day Care Center for her daughter during the weeks George wasn't around. Daddy, I need help, Samantha said. You need help? You need help? Damn insulin's tripled in just 1 month, and damn insurance is saying the tree falling on the house wasn't because of the hurricane. If it wasn't the hurricane, then what was it? I didn't push it on the house, her father growled into his phone. You need help? Join the club. George beamed when Samantha brought their daughter home. Moments later, Denise and Charlene arrived. Samantha broke down in tears. and George found himself relegated to the nursery to care for their daughter while his friend and girlfriend comforted his ex-wife. "Women, huh, Cynthia?" George chuckled. "Oh, wait. You're one of them too, aren't you? Man, I'm in trouble now. But promise me, no matter what, you'll always love me, okay?" "I will," Charlene reassured him from the doorway. "George, you need to come see." Tearfully, Samantha confessed her struggles as a waitress. Her shifts were long and the pay was barely enough, heavily reliant on unpredictable tips. "What do you need from me?" George asked. "Yes, I'm still at work. If it weren't for the Nicole King Scholarship, I don't know where I'd be," Charlene exclaimed over the phone. "I really don't know, George," Samantha admitted, avoiding eye contact with her ex-husband. "Here, you need to talk to this woman," Charlene insisted, handing Samantha her phone. "Hello?" "Charlene, who is this?" Samantha asked. "Hi, this is Kampala Jeffries. I chair the Nicole King Scholarship. Charlene says you're a perfect fit for our assistance. Recommendations from past recipients like her hold high priority," Kampala explained in a soothing voice. "Can you make it at 3 o'clock? 3 o'clock today? What day?" Samantha inquired. "Yes, today at 3. I'll see you then, Ms. Luquette," Kampala confirmed with a laugh. "Go home now, get dressed nicely. I'm coming with you," Charlene interjected. "See, it was God's plan that I had a half day today." Samantha prepared herself by cleaning her face and dressing in nice clothes, while Charlene coached her on what to say. After Charlene approved Samantha's outfit and makeup, they headed into King Sanitation's lobby. "Hi, Mrs. Jakes. Do we see Kampala?" Charlene asked the receptionist. "You're Ms. Luquette?" Sheila Jakes smiled. "I'll inform Mrs. Jeffries you're here. Charlene, how have you been?" "She'll see you now," Sheila told Samantha shortly after. "I'll take her. I know exactly where it is," Charlene said, taking Samantha's hand and guiding her down a hallway. "Charlene, hi," greeted an attractive African-American woman, rising with a smile. "You're pregnant," Charlene exclaimed, noticing the woman's slight belly. An hour later, a glowing Charlene entered George's home. He stood and began preparing dinner. "She's going to Votech, can you believe it? She's thinking she might want to be an administrative assistant like me," Charlene chattered happily. "Do I need to worry? You hanging out with my ex-wife?" George teased. "Hey, we're both Cynthia's mama," Charlene defended. "We need to get along for the baby." George was surprised when Samantha burst into the house calling for Charlene. Charlene excused herself from George in the kitchen. Samantha eagerly presented a brochure from St. Elizabeth Parish Votech to Charlene, pointing out that they offered a child care course. They sat together on George's couch, exploring the other course options. George chuckled to himself as he flipped potato pancakes in the kitchen, thinking, "If I barged into your house like that, you'd probably shoot me." Charlene asked, "Do you have enough?" And George nodded, replying, "Yeah, plenty." "I apologize," Samantha interjected as they prepared to eat. "I know if you barged into my house like that, I'd be really upset. But I was just so excited when I saw childcare and—" "We have a doorbell," George calmly reminded her. "And I'll use it next time," Samantha promised. "How do you always get these potatoes so perfect?" Charlene asked. "He adds cream," Samantha explained. Cynthia cried suddenly, and George gestured for the women to stay seated as he fetched a bottle for the baby. Samantha offered to feed her and began unbuttoning her blouse. "Sure, go ahead," George agreed, handing Cynthia over to Samantha. George tried his best to look away. He tried his best to suppress any physical reaction while watching his ex-wife feed their baby. Charlene noticed his flushed face and patted his hand lightly. "So when do you start?" George asked as Samantha buttoned her blouse. "Oh, not next Monday, but next," Samantha replied. "I need to inform them of my decision by Friday so that they can arrange everything." "Well, I'm sure you'll do fine," George assured her, clearing the table. Uh, yes. I hope so, Samantha replied, her enthusiasm fading. I mean, remember, did I study at the University of California for a semester? Did you get 3 5s and 1 deuce? Yeah. Like your dad said, you were too busy to study. George nodded. Does anyone need a diaper change? Does someone need a dry diaper? Charlene interjected, taking Cynthia from Samantha. George was washing the dishes when he felt Samantha's arms wrap around his waist from behind. She rested her head on his shoulder. I'm sorry, Samantha whispered. It's all right. Just ring the doorbell next time, okay? George replied. No, not for that, Samantha said softly, releasing him. George turned slightly to look at her over his shoulder. For everything. For all this, Samantha sobbed, then turned and hurried out of George's house. George squeezed the water out of the sponge and put it on a small wire stand at the back of the sink. He heard Samantha's car drive away. He could hear Charlene humming to Cynthia in the distance as she carried her from the nursery to the living room. Yeah, I'm sorry too, George said. But I'm not really sorry. When he entered the living room, Charlene looked up from her place on the couch. Her warm, joyful smile made George smile back. After locking the front door, he joined her on the couch. Charlene giggled as George effortlessly pulled her and Cynthia onto his lap. George caught Charlene's scent. His fingers touched Charlene's silky hair and just below it. So, Samantha, I'm not sorry at all, George thought as his hand stealthily slid up Charlene's leg, feeling the smooth material of her tights. I hate tights, George muttered aloud. Yes, go on, Charlene giggled. Oh, hello, chuckled George, touching the lace on her stockings. Yeah, when I realized I had half a day, Charlene hinted. And you spent it with my ex-wife? George teased her, bending down to kiss her gently. Yeah, George. No, take that hand away, Charlene protested. Did someone forget something? George asked. No, Charlene giggled. Charlene carried Cynthia to the nursery, kissed the baby gently, and put her in the crib. Turning around, Charlene pulled off her dress. George chuckled as an enthusiastic Charlene ran into the living room. He grabbed her and laid her on her back on the couch. They had a nice time. The next day, Hank and George met at the dead-end diner for their usual meatloaf with a choice of red or brown gravy. The charming red-haired blonde danced energetically to a hip-hop track, but both Hank and George lamented that the music had changed since Chet Atkins passed away. You know, this girl probably doesn't even know who Chet Atkins is, Hank remarked, nodding toward the girl who was taking off her faux leopard print top. Yes, probably not, George agreed, thinking about what Charlene would look like in such an outfit. The thought of her in a leopard print top and matching miniskirt made him burn with desire. After Hank warmly blessed George for Charlene's marriage proposal, he kindly paid for their lunch. George reluctantly admitted that he could not get married in the Catholic Church because of his divorce. It doesn't matter. We are Lutherans. Larry Elgin from Atonement Lutheran will marry you two, Hank said cheerfully, waving away his concern. After leaving the diner, Hank immediately called Debbie to share the good news. They warned Debbie not to tell Charlene about it, who never found out that the wedding ring burned a hole in George's pocket. When George drove up to his former home to pick up Cynthia, he found that Samantha was already dressed for work as a waitress at Casa Ole. Hi, I was just about to call you, Samantha grimaced. Billy called, Monique quit and left. All right, George agreed, wrinkling his nose at the dilapidated house he used to call home. The place was in desperate need of cleaning, with dust and dirt everywhere. The kitchen counter hadn't been wiped down since breakfast earlier that morning. George noticed the skillet Samantha had used to cook her bacon and scrambled eggs. Yeah, George, I'm aware. The place is a mess, Samantha snapped as George escorted Cynthia to the door. But you know what? You don't live here anymore, I do. You don't live here anymore, George. No, Samantha, I'm not sorry at all, George said with a smile, as he strapped Cynthia into her car seat.